right, welcome back everyone to the deep dive. We've got a really fascinating topic to dig into today. We're going to be talking about, well, reading difficulties and how we even figure out if a student is struggling with reading in the first place. And particularly how that works when we're thinking about students who are learning English, whether it's their first language or whether they're coming to it later on.
Yeah, early identification is really key here. I mean, we want to get students the support they need as early as possible, right?
Hmm.
So it's important to understand how we measure these reading skills and how that might differ between students who are EL1s, so English as a first language learners, and those who are ELLs, English language learners.
Definitely. And to get into all this, we're going to be taking a deep dive into a meta-analysis that came out just this year, January 2025, actually, and it was published in the Educational Psychology Review, which is a pretty big deal in the world of education research. I mean, this meta-analysis really brings together a whole bunch of studies that have looked at how researchers are trying to identify those decoding difficulties in students.
Right. So rather than just focusing on one single study, we're getting a much broader, like a bird's eye view of what the research landscape tells us about this whole process of pinpointing reading struggles. And I think this is super valuable for anyone listening who's, involved in education in any, whether it's as a teacher, a parent, a researcher, really anyone who's interested in how kids learn to read.
Absolutely. And the initial overview of this meta-analysis really lays out some really critical questions that we're going to be unpacking together today.
Yeah.
Things like what types of assessments are even being used out there to assess these decoding skills? Are researchers taking different approaches depending on whether they're looking at a student who is an ELL versus an EL1?
Yeah, that's a really important question.
And if they are taking different approaches, does that actually tell us anything about whether the nature of the decoding difficulties is different between these two groups of students?
Right. So are those struggles manifesting themselves differently, even though the end result is the same, have a difficulty with reading?
Exactly. And then ultimately, we want to see what the research actually tells us about how well these different measures work, right?
Yeah.
Like how effective are they at actually pinpointing those students who might be struggling with reading?
Right. So it's not just about having a measure. It's about having a measure that actually does what it's supposed to do,
Yeah.
which is to accurately identify those kids who need extra support.
For sure. Okay, so before we jump into the nitty-gritty of the different types of assessments and all that, let's take a step back for a second.
Okay.
When we talk about decoding and reading, what are we actually talking about?
Yeah, so decoding it's really the foundation of reading, right? Yeah. It's the ability to take those squiggles on a page, the letters, and connect them to the sounds that we make when we speak. So it's using your knowledge of phonics, those letter-sound relationships, to actually sound out a word. And this is essential for being able to read fluently and then, of course, to understand what you're reading.
Right. So it's like you're unlocking the code of written language. You're taking those symbols and turning them into something meaningful. Now, how do researchers go about measuring how well a student can do this?
Okay, well, the meta-analysis points to two main types of decoding assessments that researchers are using. Real-word reading assessments and then non-word reading assessments. Now, real-word assessments are pretty straightforward, right? You give a student a list of real words in English, and you ask them to read them out loud. And how they perform on this type of test can depend on, well, not just their decoding skills, but also, how many of those words they've actually seen before, how much they know those words.
Right. It makes sense. If you've seen the word dog a million times, you probably don't have to sound it out anymore. You just recognize it. So real word assessments they're kind of tapping into both, right? Both decoding and vocabulary. Now, non-word assessments, I'm guessing those are a little different.
Yeah, they are. Non-word assessments are really designed to isolate those phonological decoding skills. So they use these made-up words, or what we call pseudo-words, strings of letters that look like they could be words. They follow the rules of English phonology, but they're not actually real words. So things like blick or froom.
Okay.
And because these aren't words that a student would have memorized before, they have to rely solely on their knowledge of letter sounds to try to figure out how to pronounce them. So it gives us a cleaner picture of how well their decoding mechanics are actually working.
So real words give us that bigger picture of their word reading ability, which is, influenced by all sorts of things.
Right.
And non-words are really zeroing in on that sounding out skill.
Yeah.
Now, the meta-analysis found something really interesting about these two types of assessments, especially when it comes to identifying students with reading difficulties.
Yeah, it did. It found that across all these studies, there was a consistent pattern. Students who were assessed using those real word reading tests, they tended to be identified as having more significant decoding deficits compared to when they were assessed using non-word reading tasks.
Now, that is interesting. I'm curious, what do you think that might be?
Well, the researchers, they suggested that it's because reading real words involves more than just decoding,
Yeah.
right? Like we were saying, it involves recognizing words you've seen before. It involves understanding what those words mean.
Yeah, yeah.
So if a student is having trouble with those other areas, like their vocabulary or their ability to recognize familiar words, it could actually make their decoding difficulties seem even worse.
Mhm.
Right. They might stumble over a real word, not just because they can't sound it out, but because they don't know what it means.
Yeah.
So that meaning piece, that comprehension piece, can kind of muddy the waters a little bit.
Right, right. And this is especially important to think about when we're talking about those English language learners, those ELLs, because
Exactly.
they might be developing their decoding skills perfectly fine, but their vocabulary might still be catching up.
Mhm.
And so a real word assessment might not give us a totally accurate picture of their underlying decoding abilities.
Right. It could be underestimating those skills because they're still grappling with the vocabulary aspect of it.
Exactly, exactly. Which leads us to the next big question that this meta-analysis tackled. Are researchers using the same types of decoding measures for ELLs and EL1s when they're trying to identify reading difficulties?
Well, and according to this meta-analysis, it seems like they're not always doing that.
Okay.
So they found that there is a tendency to use different decoding measures when screening for reading difficulties in ELLs compared to EL1s.
That makes sense to me, considering what we just talked about with vocabulary and all that. But
Yeah.
but what kinds of differences are we actually talking about here? The overview didn't really get into the specifics of those measures.
Right, and the full meta-analysis would dive deeper into the exact types of measures used, of course. But for our conversation here, the key takeaway is that there isn't this uniformity in how we're assessing decoding across these two groups of students.
Right, right.
So for instance, when we're looking at ELLs, the research might use assessments that are specifically designed to minimize the impact of vocabulary knowledge. Maybe they're using shorter words or they're focusing on those phonetic patterns that are common across different languages.
Oh, interesting.
Maybe they even incorporate tasks in the student's native language to get a sense of their phonological awareness skills in that language. Whereas with EL1s, the research might be more likely to use those standard English real word and non-word reading tests without those kind of linguistic accommodations.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a bit of a mixed bag out there when it comes to assessment approaches, depending on who we're looking at, EL1s or ELLs. And this brings up a really important question, doesn't it? I mean, if we're not using the same tools to measure decoding in these two groups, how can we really compare their reading difficulties?
Yeah, it's a very valid point. And that's exactly what the meta-analysis looked at next.
Yeah.
Whether using these different methods actually leads to different patterns in how those decoding difficulties show up.
Right, right. So, are we seeing distinct decoding profiles between ELOs who struggle with reading and EL1s who struggle with reading just because of the way we're measuring them?
Exactly, yeah. And here's a fascinating finding. Even though there are those differences in assessment methods, the meta-analysis found that the size of the decoding deficit, so how much lower the decoding abilities are for students who struggle compared to those who don't, it was actually pretty similar between the two groups.
Wow, okay. So even though we might be measuring things a little differently, the extent to which students struggle with decoding seems to be pretty consistent, regardless of their first language.
Yeah, that's the takeaway. So while things like background knowledge and vocabulary development can obviously be different for these two groups of students, the core issue, the mechanics of decoding, it seems to play out in a similar way when reading difficulties are present.
That's really interesting. So it's not that the difficulties are fundamentally different, it's just that the context in which they're occurring is different.
Yeah.
So let's step back and look at the big picture here. What are some of the key implications of this meta-analysis? What should someone listening to this really take away from all of this research?
Well, one of the biggest takeaways is that those real word-based assessments, the ones that incorporate vocabulary knowledge, those seem to be better at identifying those more pronounced decoding difficulties. And this makes sense because, when we're reading in the real world, we're not just decoding sounds, we're interacting with actual words that have meaning.
Right. It's not just about sounding it out. It's about making sense of it.
Exactly, yeah. And the meta-analysis also highlights the challenges that come with assessing ELLs, where their developing English vocabulary can really affect how they perform on those reading tasks, even if their underlying decoding skills are strong. So it really emphasizes the need to be careful about how we interpret those assessment results, especially when we're working with students who are learning English.
It's about looking beyond the score, right? It's about understanding the whole child and all the factors that might be influencing their reading performance. Now, it sounds like the researchers who did this meta-analysis have a pretty clear recommendation for future research in this area.
Yeah, they do. They strongly suggest that future studies should try to be more consistent in the types of decoding measures they use, whether they're looking at EL1s or ELLs. Having that consistency would make it much easier to compare the results of different studies and ultimately to get a clearer, more unified understanding of how reading skills develop and what challenges arise for different types of learners.
Right, so it's about building a more robust and reliable body of research that we can all learn from.
Yeah, exactly.
So, for anyone listening, whether you're a teacher, a researcher, a policymaker, the message here is pretty clear. Let's try to get on the same page when it comes to assessing decoding. That way, we can get a better handle on how to best support all learners. Now, before we wrap up, let's bring this back to the listener for a moment. Why should all of this research about decoding measures even matter to someone who's not, a researcher or an educator?
Well, I think this deep dive provides some really valuable insights into how we identify reading difficulties and the crucial role that those assessment tools play in that process. So even if you're not directly involved in education, understanding that there are different assessment approaches out there and what the implications of those differences might be, it can really help you understand the complexities of reading development and the challenges that some students face.
Right. It's about having a more informed perspective on how we support all learners.
Yeah, exactly.
So to summarize everything we've talked about today, this meta-analysis has shown us some really important things. Real word assessments tend to be better at identifying those more pronounced decoding deficits. Researchers often use different approaches when they're assessing ELLs versus EL1s. But even with those differences, the magnitude of the decoding difficulty seems to be pretty similar between the two groups. And the researchers are calling for greater consistency in how we measure these skills moving forward. And this brings us to a final thought, something for you, the listener, to really chew on.
Yeah.
We've seen how important a student's knowledge of real words is in how we identify reading difficulties. So the question is, how can we design our teaching methods right from the very beginning to better support both vocabulary development and those essential decoding skills?
Right, because they're so intertwined. You can't really have one without the other.
Exactly. And that's something for all of us to think about as we work to create a world where every student has the opportunity to become a confident, capable reader. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.